By the year 830, something fundamental had shifted in England. For decades, the coast had lived under the rhythm of raids, sails on the horizon, alarm bells, smoke, and the desperate rush to gather men before the damage was done. That pattern had shaped everything. Villages learned to hide valuables. Monasteries learned to lock doors and pray with one ear open. Lords built watchtowers and trained riders to carry warnings inland. Even when a season passed without attack, the shoreline never truly relaxed. Then, almost without anyone noticing at first, the noise began to fade. Not because the Vikings had disappeared, and not because England had finally won. The silence arrived for a more unsettling reason. The Vikings were changing their purpose. Raids were still possible, still profitable, still terrifying. But the leaders who survived long enough began to see another opportunity inside England. If you can strike a coast repeatedly, you can also hold a coast. If you can sail upriver for plunder, you can sail upriver for trade. And if you can return every summer, you can choose not to leave at all. That was the beginning of consolidation. Let's step into the year 830 and look at what England thought it was preparing for. English commanders had spent years building a defense system designed for one main problem: warning. Scouts were placed along the coast. Beacon fires were prepared on hills and headlands. Messengers were trained to ride hard from settlement to settlement. The goal was to turn a distant sail into an organized response. Cavalry moving toward a landing site, archers assembling, and leaders choosing where to fight. The system was not perfect, but it was built for raids. It assumed the enemy would arrive, strike quickly, and then flee. It assumed the Vikings were temporary, violent, yes, but ultimately passing through. A permanent presence broke that assumption. Across the sea, Viking leaders had their own discussions. Raiding was familiar. It was the old way. It brought silver, livestock, weapons, and stories. But it also brought danger. A raiding party could be trapped. A fleet could be scattered by storms. A successful raid still ended with the same question: what do we do in winter, when the sea turns and supplies run thin? Some leaders wanted more than a cycle of risk and return. They wanted stability. They wanted a foothold. So in 830, the first permanent Viking settlement in England was established. It did not begin as a grand city. It was not a fortified capital proclaiming a new kingdom. It began as a practical coastal base, small enough to build quickly, strong enough to protect supplies, and positioned to connect with sea routes. Shelter was constructed, storage was organized, a simple marketplace formed. The most important change was not what was built, but what the building implied. The Vikings were not only arriving, they were staying. For the English, this was terrifying in a different way than a raid. A raid is loud and clear. It has an obvious beginning and an obvious end. A settlement has no single dramatic moment. It simply exists, day after day, forcing the kingdom to decide how to respond. If England attacked immediately, it risked starting a larger war on terms it might not control. If it ignored the settlement, it risked allowing the Vikings to grow stronger with every season. So the English king called his advisors. The debates were tense. Some nobles demanded an immediate assault. They argued that a settlement, if allowed to expand, would become an unmovable base for future invasions. Better to strike now, while it was small. Others urged caution. They argued that a direct attack might unite Viking groups that were currently divided, drawing more ships and more warriors to England. A third position emerged as well: negotiation. If Vikings were willing to trade, perhaps trade could be used to buy time, gather information, and reduce violence. The king chose the cautious path. Messengers would be sent first. England would learn what these settlers wanted, attempt negotiation if possible, and prepare for war if the settlers revealed hostile intent. When English messengers reached the settlement, they were not met by an army preparing to march. They were met by something more confusing: routine. People were building shelter, organizing supplies, and trading with those willing to approach. The settlement did not look like an invasion camp ready to burn the countryside. It looked like a community trying to survive. That did not mean it was harmless. It meant it was complicated. The messengers returned with reports that divided opinion even further. Some argued this proved the Vikings could be negotiated with. Others argued the calm was a mask and that the settlement was simply a staging ground for a future conquest. The king found himself in a situation England had not trained for. The enemy was no longer only across the sea. The enemy was present, quiet, and patient. Then more settlements appeared. They did not all look the same. Some were clearly trade-focused, positioned near routes where goods could move between Viking ships and English markets. Others looked more defensive, built as strongpoints with storage and controlled access. A few pushed inland far enough to suggest agricultural intent, land being used not as a target, but as a resource. This diversity was itself alarming because it showed planning. It suggested the Vikings were not following a single impulse. They were experimenting. As settlements multiplied along the coast, fear spread faster than ships ever could. Rumors moved through villages and towns like wildfire. Some said the Vikings were gathering families, not just warriors. Some claimed more ships were coming than anyone could count. Some insisted the settlers were peaceful traders, while others insisted they were spies and conquerors. In a world shaped by raids, uncertainty felt like a weapon. A day without an attack did not feel like safety. It felt like the moment before something worse. The coastline fell silent, and for many people, that silence was unbearable. A loud invasion gives fear a shape. People can see sails, hear horns, and decide to run or fight. Silence forces waiting. It turns every quiet morning into suspicion. Fishermen scanned the sea longer than necessary. Farmers listened for distant sounds that never came. Parents watched the horizon instead of their children. In that atmosphere, even harmless strangers could be treated like threats because nobody knew what the new Viking presence truly meant. English leaders began to understand something important. The Vikings were not going away. A settlement changes the entire logic of the conflict. It creates a place for supplies to be stored and shared. It creates a location for leaders to meet and plan. It creates a point where more ships can arrive and find support. And it creates a psychological pressure that raids alone could never sustain because the threat is no longer seasonal, it is constant. England responded by adapting again. First came planning. The King's Council began to discuss policies that had once seemed unthinkable. How should English markets treat Viking traders? Should trade be permitted, restricted, taxed, or punished? How would the kingdom protect itself from the possibility that commerce could conceal intelligence gathering? Could negotiation prevent violence, or would it only invite deeper infiltration? At the same time, defense planning moved inland as well. If Vikings had permanent bases, raids could begin deeper and last longer. So the English began to treat certain routes, bridges, and river crossings as strategic points requiring protection. Fortifications expanded beyond the immediate coast. Wealth and sacred objects were moved to safer locations. Communities practiced evacuation and defense as routine rather than emergency. By 832, patterns were becoming clear. Some Viking settlements remained small, little more than coastal posts. Others grew faster, developing into hubs where trade and supplies made expansion possible. Together, they began to resemble a network, connected by sea routes, by shared interest, and by the ability to support one another. The Vikings were consolidating, and consolidation meant permanence. The Viking leaders also changed their own approach. Once settlement began, it demanded stability. A community cannot thrive in constant chaos. It needs rules, leadership, and predictable access to food and goods. That meant some Viking groups began to restrain violence in areas where trade mattered, not out of kindness, but out of calculation. Profit required relationships. Settlement required reputation. The Vikings did not stop being dangerous, but the way danger showed itself evolved. For England, this created a strange tension. Conflict existed alongside commerce. In some regions, negotiations began. In others, trade agreements formed, sometimes openly, sometimes quietly, sometimes with the king's approval and sometimes without it. English merchants, always alert to profit, traded goods that Vikings desired. Viking traders offered items England wanted. Mutual dependence grew in places where money and necessity outweighed hatred. That did not erase fear, it complicated it. Because every merchant deal raised the same questions. Are we buying peace or feeding the growth of an enemy? Are we reducing violence or funding the weapons that will be used against us later? The answer depended on who you asked, and that division ran through towns, courts, and churches. The monasteries watched the change with special dread. For years they had been the primary targets of raids, the easiest sources of treasure, and symbols of vulnerability. A permanent Viking presence meant permanent pressure, whether through violence, taxation, or the simple knowledge that the next raid could begin from nearby. So the English Church organized. Some religious communities strengthened defenses, some moved relics and treasures away from coastal regions, some appealed to the king for protection, and some attempted another approach: conversion. The church believed that if Vikings adopted Christianity, they might become more integrated and less hostile. Missionary efforts increased. Priests approached Viking settlements, sometimes as negotiators, sometimes as teachers, sometimes as desperate men trying to reduce bloodshed by any means available. Conversions began slowly. Not every Viking embraced the new faith, and many resisted it openly. But some were curious, some were pragmatic. Some recognized that adopting Christianity could create alliances, ease trade, and provide legitimacy in dealings with English leaders. Conversion did not erase cultural difference, but it created channels of communication that raids never could. As those channels formed, identities began to blur. In some areas, English and Vikings remained bitter enemies, fighting whenever opportunity allowed. In other areas, they became tense neighbors. Trade created familiarity. Negotiation created routine. Agreements created obligations. Over time, the simple category of enemy became harder to apply everywhere because relationships differed from place to place. Economics pushed the transformation further. Trade routes shifted, markets adjusted. Certain towns benefited from commerce with Vikings, gaining goods and wealth they had not seen before. Other towns suffered, either because they were bypassed or because they were too exposed to violence. Merchants learned to avoid areas of conflict, creating new routes that were safer but longer. Commerce continued, but it became riskier, and risk changed everything. Population patterns changed too. Some people fled exposed coasts for inland protection. Some moved into fortified settlements. Some joined local defense forces because survival demanded participation. Refugees became part of the landscape, carrying stories that fed fear and hardened opinion. In the same period, some Vikings brought families, not just warriors, because settlement required more than fighters. Where families appear, permanence follows. By 835, the consequences of consolidation were impossible to ignore. England was no longer facing a seasonal threat. It was facing an expanding presence. In practice, regions began to look different from one another. Some remained firmly under English control. Some were heavily influenced by Vikings through trade and settlement. Some were contested zones where power shifted. The idea that would later be known as the Danelaw began to form, not necessarily as a single declaration, but as a reality shaped by control, negotiation, and pressure. The coast fell silent because the conflict had changed shape. Raids did not vanish, violence did not vanish. But the central fear was no longer only the strike of a raid. It was the permanence of a rival society growing inside England's borders. Once that presence existed, fear did not require ships. Even on days when the sea was empty, people could feel the threat, because it lived on land now. Silence became its own form of pressure. A quiet coast could mean peace, or it could mean planning. It could mean trade, or it could mean preparation for a future assault. For English communities, silence demanded vigilance. For Viking settlers, silence demanded discipline. Both sides learned that the absence of noise was not the absence of danger. It was the absence of certainty. By the end of this period, England and the Vikings were no longer locked in a simple cycle of raid and response. They were shaping each other through conflict, commerce, negotiation, and cultural exchange. The island was becoming something mixed, unstable, and new. and that is what made this era so unsettling. The coast fell silent, not because war ended, but because war evolved. Fear traveled faster than ships, because fear no longer needed ships. And in that quiet, a different future began. One reason the silence felt so heavy was that it robbed England of the drama that usually made decisions easier. In the past, a raid forced an immediate response. A lord either raised men or he didn't. A town either barred its gates or it burned. With a settlement, time stretched. Every option carried risk, and every day that passed seemed to change the stakes. The king's advisors argued in circles because none of their earlier lessons fit perfectly. If they attacked, they might destroy the settlement, but they might also trigger retaliation from other Viking groups who had not yet committed to staying. If they negotiated, they might buy stability, but they might also legitimize the presence of strangers whose loyalty could never be guaranteed. Even waiting, the least aggressive option, carried danger, because waiting meant allowing the settlement to strengthen. A post that could be removed in 830 might be impossible to remove in 833. That uncertainty reached the local level as well. Coastal lords demanded clarity because they were the ones expected to answer when their people were harmed. Some began raising extra men without waiting for the king. Others negotiated privately, arranging local truces to protect harvests. In a few places, old rivalries between English factions flared again because Viking presence became another factor in internal power struggles. A lord who could trade might become richer. A lord who could defend might become more respected. The consolidation period did not only reshape the frontier between English and Viking, it also reshaped English politics within. Inside the first settlement, the Vikings faced their own problems. Building permanence required more than tents and timber. It required order. Someone had to decide how supplies were shared, how disputes were resolved, and how violence was controlled so trade could function. Even in a community built by warriors, daily life created new conflicts. Disagreements over land, theft, leadership, and responsibility. Raiding rewarded boldness. Settlement rewarded stability. Leaders who excelled in battle were not always the same leaders who could manage a growing community. That is why settlement pushed Vikings toward governance. Rules formed, not as written law at first, but as expectations that were enforced. Trade required trust, storage required protection, families required safety. All of those needs shaped behavior. Even when tensions remained high, the very act of staying created pressure to regulate violence, at least within the settlement's immediate orbit. For English observers, that was unsettling too. A raiding camp is temporary. It has no time to become sophisticated. A settlement can become an institution. It can develop leadership, resources, and allies. It can become a magnet for other ships. Every successful season made the settlement more attractive to new arrivals because newcomers could step onto shore and find shelter, supplies, and connections rather than starting from nothing. This is why fear traveled faster than ships. A single ship could raid a village, but it could not change the entire map of England. A settlement could. People understood that instinctively. They might not know the word Danelaw, but they understood the idea of zones, places where English authority weakened, where new customs appeared, where protection depended on negotiation rather than loyalty. So England's response became more layered. Beyond stationing warriors, the kingdom began to think about control in terms of administration. Which towns could be reinforced quickly? Which routes had to remain secure? Which markets needed oversight so trade did not become a pipeline for weapons and intelligence? Even small policy changes mattered. Tolls, permits, restrictions, and punishments designed to shape how people interacted with the settlers. None of this created immediate peace. It created management. And management was exhausting. Living alongside a permanent rival required constant choices. Farmers needed to decide whether to sell grain to strangers who might become enemies. Merchants needed to decide whether profit outweighed risk. Priests needed to decide whether contact was contamination or opportunity. Lords needed to decide whether negotiation was weakness or survival. The very presence of a settlement forced everyone to become strategic, even if they wanted nothing more than ordinary life. At the same time, the settlements affected Viking behavior in a predictable way. Once goods began to move through markets, violence became selective. Vikings still raided where it suited them, especially in places that resisted or offered easy gain. But around certain hubs, stability became valuable. A burnt market could not trade, a terrified village could not supply food. A region that was constantly on fire could not support a community through winter. So in some areas, the settlers moderated their own aggression, not out of compassion, but out of calculation. That created an uneven landscape. In one region, a community might experience a fragile, tense calm, punctuated by harsh demands. In another region, raids continued with brutal force. People traveling between regions carried conflicting stories, and those contradictions intensified fear. If one town traded peacefully, another town wondered why it was being burned. If one lord negotiated successfully, another suspected betrayal. Confusion fed suspicion, and suspicion fed division. By 840, the transformation was well underway. The coastline might have looked quieter, but the island itself was alive with movement. Trade flowed in new patterns. People relocated. New alliances formed and old ones fractured. Viking settlements expanded, and English defenses adapted around them. The relationship between English and Vikings was no longer defined only by battle. It was defined by proximity. In some places, that proximity still meant hatred. In other places, it meant tense cooperation. And in a few places, it began to look like something else entirely. Shared routines, mutual obligations, and a future that neither side would have chosen at the beginning, but that both were now building simply because they were there. That is why this period cannot be described as a clean conquest or a clean victory. It was a transition. The Vikings did not simply replace England, and England did not simply expel the Vikings. Instead, the island began to change from within. Conflict continued, but alongside conflict came integration. Partial, uneven, and often reluctant, but real. The coast fell silent, and in that silence the island became a different place.